Have you ever wondered what England, the tiny, rain-swept island on the edge of Europe, was doing while Spain and Portugal was now at the top of their game? It's a story that doesn't start with grand fleets or massive armies. It starts with a whisper, a footnote in history, while Spanish galleons were already hauling gold from the New World. Let's rewind to the late 1400s. Spain, unified and ambitious, sends Columbus across the Atlantic, carving up the globe with Portugal as if it were a birthday cake. And England was a mess. It was like a patient recovering from a long, brutal illness. The Wars of the Roses, a vicious civil war, had left the country broke, divided, and exhausted. The new king, Henry VII, was more worried about keeping his own crown than finding new continents. How can you dream of conquering the world when you're still fighting your own people? But even in this fog of recovery, a tiny spark of ambition ignited. In 1497, just 5 years after Columbus, an Italian navigator named John Cabot convinced the famously tight-fisted King Henry to fund a voyage. Cabot wasn't looking for a new world. He was looking for a shortcut to Asia, a northern route that would bypass the Spanish-controlled south. He didn't find silks or spices. He found cod and a whole lot of fog-shrouded coastline we now know as Newfoundland. There were no cities of gold, no grand civilizations to conquer. It was, by all accounts, a bit of a disappointment. He planted the English flag on this cold, empty shore. This wasn't a conquest. It was a question mark placed on the map. It was England's quiet, almost shy, rebuttal to the Spanish and Portuguese duel. It was a claim based not on a pope's decree, but on the simple act of showing up. Think of it as planting a seed in frozen soil, a seed that wouldn't sprout for decades. For the next few decades, that seed lay dormant. England was too busy with its own drama to water it, and the biggest drama of all was about to erupt, not on a distant shore, but in the king's own bedroom. Enter Henry VIII. We all know the story. A king desperate for a male heir, a pope who won't grant him a divorce, and a break from the Catholic Church that would change the world forever. This wasn't just about a king and his love life. This great matter, as it was called, fundamentally rewired England's identity. Overnight, England went from being a Catholic nation, a peer of Spain, to a Protestant rebel. The English Channel, that narrow strip of water, suddenly became a massive ideological and theological divide. This personal quarrel between a king and a pope had unintentionally set the stage for a global showdown. Why? Because now, any conflict with Spain wasn't just about territorial trade. It was about religion. It was a holy struggle. This is where the story gets really interesting. England was still too poor and weak to challenge the Spanish military head. So it turned to a different kind of warfare. It turned to the sea dogs, the privateers. Men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins. Make sure to make note of these names, as we will discuss them in depth later. In England, these men were heroes, patriotic adventurers sanctioned by their Protestant queen, Elizabeth I. England's path to empire, therefore, didn't begin with colonists and plows. It began with a divorce and a license to raid. The rivalry that would define the next century wasn't born on a battlefield, but in a king's desperate desire for a son and the religious revolution it unleashed. So, while Spain was building a formal empire with forts, governors, and missionaries, England was running a guerrilla war at sea. It was a strategy born of weakness, but it was incredibly effective. These sea dogs learned the winds and currents of the Atlantic, honing their skills in countless skirmishes. Think about the difference in mindset. The Spanish conquest was centralized, top-down, and bureaucratic. The English approach was decentralized, opportunistic, and driven by a potent mix of profit and Protestant zeal. It was the scrappy underdog learning to fight smart, not Hoostsard. This period, from Cabot's lonely voyage to the rise of the Sea Dogs, was the critical incubation period for the British Empire. England wasn't building an empire yet. It was building the tools, the mindset, and the people who would one day do so. Now let's focus on another soon-to-be major player, France. While Spain was busy dominating the Caribbean and South America, another European heavyweight was watching, waiting, and plotting. This is the story of how France, a rival with a very different strategy, began to carve out its own American destiny. While Spain was throwing everything it had at conquering the Americas, France was playing a different game, a calculated game of chess. Instead of launching a full frontal assault on Spain's fortified Caribbean heartland, the French opted for a clever strategy of strategic bypass. They looked at the map, saw the vast, unclaimed territories to the north, and thought, why fight for scraps of Spain's pie when we can bake our own? But France's ambitions weren't immediately focused across the Atlantic. For much of the early 16th century, their eyes and their armies were firmly fixed on Europe. The French kings, especially the flamboyant and ambitious Francis I, were entangled in a series of grueling conflicts known as the Italian Wars. These weren't just minor skirmishes. They were decades-long, ruinously expensive power struggles against their arch-rivals, the Habsburgs, who controlled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. This massive continental war drained the French treasury and tied up the very soldiers and ships that could have been used to build a transatlantic empire. So, while Spanish conquistadors were marching through Aztec and Incan lands, French knights were clashing with German and Spanish pikemen on the fields of Italy. This European entanglement meant that France's initial forays into the Americas were more like scouting missions than full-blown invasions. They were probing for weaknesses, searching for opportunities, and directly challenging the Spanish and Portuguese monopoly on the New World. This bold new chapter began in 1524, when King Francis I, despite being neck-deep in the Italian wars, sponsored an Italian navigator named Giovanni da Verrazzano's mission was twofold. First, to find the legendary Northwest Passage, a hypothetical northern waterway to Asia that would allow French merchants to bypass the Spanish-controlled southern routes. Second, he was to map the North American coastline and plant the French flag wherever he could. Sailing a ship named La Dauphine, Verrazzano charted the Atlantic seaboard from what is now North Carolina all the way up to Newfoundland. He explored New York Harbor, sailed past Block Island, and entered Narragansett Bay. What he found was a vast, temperate land, rich in potential, and most importantly, conspicuously empty of Spanish forts or settlements. His voyage was a monumental act of defiance. It put a huge swath of North America on the map for France, laying a claim that was, for the moment, purely symbolic, but would soon become very real. 10 years later, in 1534, France doubled down on this northern strategy. This time, the man for the job was a tough, experienced mariner from St. Malo, named Jacques Cartier. Where Verrazzano had mapped the coast, Cartier was tasked with pushing inland, with exploring the mysterious interior of this new continent. On his first voyage, he sailed into a massive gulf, which he named the Gulf of St. Lawrence. He encountered the indigenous peoples, the Micmac and the Iroquoians, and engaged in some early, tentative trade. But it was on his second voyage, a year later, that Cartier made his breakthrough. He sailed past the mouth of the Gulf and found a mighty river, the highway into the heart of the continent, the St. Lawrence River. He sailed up this waterway, past the future site of Quebec City, to the bustling Iroquoian village of Stadacona. His guides there told him of an even larger settlement further up. Pushing on, Cartier reached a prominent hill on a large island, which he named Montreal, the future site of Montreal. These voyages were game changers. Cartier had established that this wasn't just a coastline. It was a vast, navigable continent. He had forged the first crucial links with the native inhabitants and established France's foundational claim to the interior of North America. This vast territory, stretching from the cold waters of the Atlantic deep into the Great Lakes, would become known as New France. But how could France legally justify this? The Pope himself had drawn a line on the map and given the entire New World to Spain and Portugal in the Treaty of Tours. Well, King Francis I had a famously witty and powerful response to that. He openly mocked the treaty, delivering one of history's greatest quips. He reportedly asked to see the clause in Adam's will that excluded him from a share of the world. Think about the audacity of that statement. It was a direct slap in the face to both the Pope and the King of Spain. Francis was essentially saying that a decree from the Vatican held no power over the ambitions of sovereign kings. He was rejecting the idea that divine authority could be used to carve up the globe for the benefit of his rivals. This wasn't just a witty remark. It was a revolutionary, legal, and ideological challenge. It provided the philosophical justification for every French ship that would sail to the Americas. It gave French privateers license to do crazy things, just as England had done. And it set the stage for centuries of conflict between the great powers of Europe for control of the New World. The seeds of New France had been sown, not just in the soil of North America, but in the defiant spirit of a king who refused to be left out of the race for a global empire. So, while Spain consolidated its power in the south, France was playing the long game in the north. Their approach was less about immediate plunder and more about strategic positioning, trade, and long-term settlement. It was a slower, more deliberate strategy, but one that would eventually build a vast and unique French empire in North America, with a culture and legacy that endures to this day. The stage was now set for a clash of empires. At this point, I want to tackle a massive question, one that has fascinated historians for centuries. Was the Spanish Empire in the New World actually profitable? When we think of the Spanish conquistadors, we picture mountains of gold and ships overflowing with treasure. But was that the reality? Did Spain really strike it rich, or is the story more complicated? Let's dig in and find out. The short answer is a resounding yes. Ultimately. Ultimately. The Spanish Empire was immensely profitable for the Spanish crown. The sheer volume of silver and gold that crossed the Atlantic fundamentally reshaped the global economy and turned Spain into the world's first true superpower. But here's the twist. It didn't start that way. In fact, for the first few decades, Spain's American adventure looked like it might be a massive financial failure. Let's rewind to the very beginning, to the late 15th and early 16th centuries. When Columbus and the first wave of explorers landed in the Caribbean, they weren't greeted by golden cities. They established colonies on islands like Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, as well as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. The initial goal was simple: find gold and find it fast. They implemented a system known as the encomienda, which granted Spanish settlers the right to demand tribute and forced labor from the indigenous populations. The idea was to use this labor to mine for gold and farm the land. But the reality was grim. The initial gold finds on these islands were modest, far from the legendary treasures they dreamed of. The indigenous Taino population was decimated by disease and brutal working conditions, leading to a catastrophic labor shortage. Colonies like Jamaica produced very little wealth. Their primary value was strategic, serving as supply bases and outposts to protect shipping lanes. For the Spanish crown and the early investors, these first colonies were a huge disappointment. They were costing a fortune to maintain and yielding very little in return. Imagine pouring your life savings into an expedition, only to get a few trinkets and a bunch of logistical headaches. That was the situation for many early Spanish colonists. For a while, it seemed like the entire New World project might be a bust. So, if the first colonies were a financial drain, where did the legendary riches come from? The game completely changed with two pivotal events. The conquest of the Aztec Empire in Mexico by Cortés in 1521, and the conquest of the Inca Empire in Peru by Francisco Pizarro in the 1530s. These were not small island chieftains. They were vast, wealthy, and highly organized empires. The initial plunder from these conquests was staggering. The sheer amount of gold and silver artifacts looted from cities like Tenochtitlan and Cusco was unlike anything Europeans had ever seen. This was the first major injection of wealth that started to turn the tide. But even this initial plunder, as incredible as it was, pales in comparison to what came next. The real, sustained, mind-boggling profitability of the Spanish Empire didn't come from looting temples or melting down jewelry. It came from mining. Specifically, silver mining. In the 1540s, the Spanish made two discoveries that would change the world forever. First, they uncovered massive silver deposits in Zacatecas in northern Mexico. Then, just a few years later, they found an entire mountain made of silver, or in a place called Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia, which was then part of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Potosi in particular became the single richest source of silver the world had ever known. It quickly grew into one of the largest and wealthiest cities on the planet, a bustling, chaotic hub of industry and exploitation high in the Andes Mountains. To get the silver out of the ground, the Spanish perfected and expanded a brutal system of forced labor called the meta. This was an adaptation of an old Inca system, where communities were required to provide laborers for state projects. Under the Spanish, however, the meta became a terrifying and deadly obligation. Indigenous men from hundreds of miles around were forced to travel to Potosi and Zacatecas to work in the mines under horrific conditions. The work was dangerous. The mercury used to extract the silver was poisonous, and the mortality rate was appallingly high. It was this forced labor that fueled the engine of the Spanish Empire, extracting billions of dollars worth of silver by modern standards. This river of silver flowed from the mines of Mexico and Peru, down to the port cities, and onto massive treasure fleets that sailed for Spain once or twice a year. The Spanish crown claimed a quinto real, or the royal fifth, which was a 20% tax on all precious metals mined in the Americas. This tax alone generated an unimaginable fortune for the kings of Spain. It funded their massive armies, their lavish courts, and their endless wars across Europe against the English, the French, and the Dutch. The silver from the New World allowed Spain to dominate European politics for over a century. This influx of wealth had profound effects, not just on Spain, but on the entire world. It fueled a period of massive inflation across Europe, known as the Price Revolution. It also created the first truly global trade network. Spanish silver was so plentiful that it became the de facto global currency. It was shipped from Spain to the Netherlands to pay soldiers, from there to Italy to buy luxury goods, and all the way to China, via the Manila galleons, to purchase silk, porcelain, and spices. Your stereotypical image of a pirate yelling pieces of 8. Those pieces of 8 were Spanish silver dollars minted in Mexico or Peru, and they were the most recognized and trusted currency on the planet for centuries. However, this incredible wealth was, in many ways, a curse for Spain itself. The Spanish economy became dangerously dependent on American silver. Instead of developing domestic industries or agriculture, Spain simply used its silver to buy whatever it needed from other countries. When the flow of silver began to decline in the 17th century due to mine exhaustion and increased smuggling, the Spanish economy went into a steep decline, from which it never fully recovered. The empire had become a conduit for wealth, rather than a creator of it. The silver passed through Spain, but it ended up enriching the bankers and merchants of Genoa, Amsterdam, and London. So, to circle back to our original question, was the Spanish Empire in the New World profitable? Absolutely. It was extraordinarily, almost unimaginably profitable, thanks to the silver mines of Mexico and Peru. But this profitability came at a catastrophic human cost to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And ultimately, it created an economic dependency that crippled Spain's own long-term development. The story of Spain's wealth is a classic example of a resource curse, a tale of incredible riches that brought both immense power and eventual decline. It is a powerful reminder that the glitter of gold and silver can often hide a much darker and more complex reality. Now let's return our focus to Jamaica. However, let's talk a little about religion. Just imagine the first Spanish ships cut through the Caribbean's turquoise waters. They didn't just bring soldiers and steel. They brought words meant to conquer before the first sword was even drawn. Imagine this scene. A Spanish captain stands on a pristine beach in the Caribbean, facing the Taino people. The locals watch, bewildered, as he unfurls a scroll and begins to read. He's not speaking their language. He's reading in Castilian, a tongue they've never heard. A proclamation called the Requerimiento. It's a legal document, a bizarre piece of political theater. It declares that their land now belongs to a distant Spanish king and a Roman pope. It demands their immediate submission. The penalty for refusal, war, enslavement, and the loss of everything they hold dear. For Taino, the words are just noise, a strange and ominous ritual. But for the Spanish, this act justifies the horrors to come. The first act of law in this new world was an act of profound, calculated absurdity. Immediately after this verbal conquest, a spiritual one began. Priests would step ashore, raising wooden crosses in the sand. They'd chant prayers in Latin, another language alien to the island. With these rituals, They believed they were sanctifying the land, cleansing it of its pagan spirits, and claiming it for their god. But for the Taino, this was a sacred desecration. Their own spiritual world, deeply woven into every tree, river, and stone, was being violently overwritten. The land itself was being told it belonged to a new faith, a faith that arrived with chains. This grim paradox is literally carved into the foundations of the first Spanish settlements. Take Sevilla la Nueva, founded on the north coast of Jamaica in 1509. Here, the Spanish built their churches and chapels. They're symbols of a new, civilized order. But look closer. Who quarried the stone for those altars? Who mixed the mortar for those walls? It was the Taino. Enslaved, brutalized, and forced to build the very structures that celebrated their own subjugation. The architecture of faith was raised upon a foundation of human suffering. The holy water mixed with tears, and the cornerstones were laid upon the bones of a dying people. But history is never a one-sided story. Long before the Spanish drew their maps and named the mountains, the land itself held a power they could never truly conquer. In Jamaica, two regions became legends of defiance: the Cockpit Country and the Blue Mountains. This wasn't just difficult terrain. It was a living, breathing architecture of resistance. Imagine a landscape of near impenetrable limestone hills, shaped like an egg carton, covered in dense, green jungle. Imagine steep ravines, hidden caves, and a maze of valleys where an army could get lost in minutes. This was the fortress for those who refused to be broken. The Maroons saw this treacherous landscape not as a barrier, but as an escape. The steep ridges were their watchtowers. The trees provided food, medicine, and materials for shelter. The land itself became an active participant in their fight for freedom. It sheltered them, fed them, and confused their pursuers. Deep within this rebel territory, caves became the heart of this new, defiant society. If you could peel back the layers of time, you'd find the evidence pressed into the earth. You'd find pottery fragments, discarded shells, and the bones of the small conies they survived on. These caves were everything at once. They were a kitchen, providing sustenance. They were a nursery, where new generations of free children were born. They were a fortress, offering protection from colonial patrols. And they were a cathedral. Here, in the cool, echoing darkness, a powerful spiritual resistance took root. Meanwhile, a Spanish friar, frustrated by his inability to convert them, wrote in his journal about their resilience. He noted with despair how they kept the old gods alive, mixing their idols with the saints. But this wasn't just a simple mix and match. This was a deliberate act of spiritual warfare, a process we call syncretism. They took the symbols of their oppressors, the cross, the saints, and reinfused them with their own ancestral meanings. They re-enchanted the world that the Spanish had tried to disenchant. This forces us to ask a profound question. Can a landscape become a political statement? Can a mountain range be an act of rebellion? For the Maroons, the answer was a resounding yes. The land was their ally, their map, their memory, or were they doing something more? They were actively forging a new one. The grand cathedrals the Spanish erected stand empty. Their bells, once symbols of authority, now slowly corroding in the salty sea air. It feels like a failure, a spiritual conquest that never truly began. The Maroons, escaped Africans, were a phantom presence, always fleeing, always resisting. And the enslaved Africans, torn from their homes and forced to labor on plantations, their spirits remained tethered to another shore, another life. The friars were preaching to echoes in a land that seemed to reject their message. But beneath this surface of abandonment, something incredible was happening. An invisible alchemy was at work, a quiet revolution of the soul. It wasn't happening in the grand churches or the town squares. It was unfolding in the cramped barracks, on the small provision grounds where the enslaved were allowed to grow their own food, and in hidden clearings deep within the forest, far from the watchful eyes of their masters. Here, in these secret spaces, the heartbeats of Africa pulsed with defiant life. The rhythms of the Yoruba, the Akan, and the Congo peoples echoed through the night. These were not just drum beats. They were ancient languages, carrying entire cosmologies rich with ancestors, elemental spirits, and a profound connection to the divine. These were belief systems that had sustained communities for millennia, and they were not so easily erased. These powerful African traditions didn't exist in a vacuum. They met the lingering vestiges of Tano belief. Now, picture the sheer ingenuity of the human spirit under immense pressure. The enslaved Africans, forbidden from practicing their own religions, did not simply abandon their beliefs. Instead, out of both necessity and incredible creativity, they began to pour their own spiritual wine into the new bottles of Catholic ritual. They were forced to attend Mass, to learn the catechism, to venerate the saints. So they did, but they did it on their own terms. This wasn't just a simple blending of traditions, like mixing two colors of paint. This was a forging, a creation of something entirely new in the crucible of survival. A new theology was being born, a defiant act of continuity disguised as conversion. Under the watchful, yet often oblivious, gaze of the Spanish, a profound spiritual fusion was taking place. It was here, in this fertile and unseen synthesis, that the roots of a uniquely Jamaican spirit began to take hold. This was the birthplace of Creole, a worldview born from the collision of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Have you ever heard a Jamaican elder whisper, a warning about a dupi, a restless spirit, lingering at a crossroads? That's a direct echo of this time. The crossroads, a potent symbol in many West African traditions, became a place of spiritual significance in Jamaica. The dupi itself, part ghost, part ancestor, is a concept woven from multiple threads of belief about the afterlife. Well, think about the transcendent rhythm of a drum, a sound that can move you physically and spiritually at the same time. That power, the ability to call to both the body and the soul, to induce a state of trance or spiritual ecstasy, is a direct inheritance from African religious practices. It's a sacred technology that survived the Middle Passage and found a new home in the hills of Jamaica. This new cosmology was incredibly clever. It was a masterclass in syncretism. A Catholic saint, displayed on a church altar, might be publicly venerated, but in the private heart of an enslaved worshipper, that same saint wore the face of an African Orisha, a deity from the Yoruba pantheon. San Patri, who famously drove the snakes out of Ireland, could be seen as a parallel to Ogan, the Orishas of iron and war. The Virgin Mary, a figure of maternal compassion, could be invoked as a representation of Yama, the mother of all living things and ruler of the seas. The invocation was seamless. One could pray to Saint Barbara for protection from storms, while simultaneously honoring Shango, the Orishas of thunder and lightning. To the outside observer, it looked like Catholic piety, but to the practitioner, it was an act of profound spiritual preservation. It was a way to keep their gods, their ancestors, and their identity alive, hidden in plain sight. What the Spanish authorities condemned as heresy, as a corruption of the true faith, was, in reality, a testament to the unkillable nature of the human spirit. The soul will always find a way to be free. This story forces us to ask a difficult and profound question. Can a faith truly be imposed on a people, or does the human soul, when cornered and threatened, always find a way to preserve its deepest truths? The Spanish believed they were replacing one set of beliefs with another, but the people they sought to control were not empty vessels. They were inheritors of rich, complex traditions, one that honored their past while allowing them to survive the present. This process wasn't just about religion, it was about identity. It was about refusing to be erased. By merging their ancestral beliefs with the imposed faith, the enslaved people of Jamaica were performing a constant act of cultural resistance. It's in the music, the language, the folklore, and the spiritual life of the island. The ability to hold multiple truths at once, to see the sacred in unexpected places, to find resilience and joy in the face of hardship. These are the hallmarks of the Jamaican spirit, forged in the fires of history. The friars with their empty churches may have seen failure, but they were blind to the true miracle unfolding all around them. It wasn't a miracle of conversion, but a miracle of creation. A new world of belief was being born, not in the cathedrals, but in the heart of the people. It is a powerful reminder that culture is not a static object to be replaced. It's a story of politics, exploration, and the incredible power of words. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more dives into history. Part 2, Introduction to